Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed members of the jury, honored guests, and friends, today we gather to discuss an unprecedented moment in the courtroom, a moment that will surely be etched into the annals of legal history. Ibrahim Traoré, a name that has echoed through the halls of justice, is now at the center of a case that has captured the attention of many. It was in the court of Judge Thomas that the fine of $500 million was handed down to Mr. Traoré. A staggering sum, one that seems almost beyond comprehension. The decision, a reflection of the severity of the charges brought against him, was intended to send a message to society, to future offenders, and perhaps most pointedly, to Mr. Traoré himself. However, what happened next was not what anyone, not even Judge Thomas himself, could have anticipated. Rather than showing remorse or acceptance of the verdict, Ibrahim Traoré took a very different route. He turned the tables, expertly shifting the atmosphere in that courtroom. The tension in the room began to swell, the air thick with anticipation, as he stood before the judge and addressed the court with an eloquence that left many speechless. In moments, the narrative changed from one of judgment to one of defiance. He expertly manipulated the dialogue, questioning the very foundation of the legal process, challenging the fairness of the ruling, and even casting doubt on the integrity of those who stood before him. What began as a straightforward case of legal consequences quickly became a spectacle. The courtroom, once a solemn place of justice, transformed into a stage for a masterclass in persuasion. Mr. Traoré was not simply defending his actions, he was systematically dismantling the authority of the court. With each word, each phrase, he turned the jury's perception. He didn't just stand in opposition, he questioned the legitimacy of the proceedings, the fairness of the fine, and the very principles that underpinned the case. By the time his statement reached its crescendo, the court was no longer simply divided. It was a battlefield of ideas, where the lines between right and wrong blurred into an uncomfortable gray. Those in the jury box, once certain of their position, found themselves questioning whether the system itself could be trusted to deliver impartial justice. The fine of $500 million, initially seen as a fitting penalty, now seemed like a mere footnote in the broader, more complex narrative Mr. Traoré had skillfully woven. The power of his rhetoric was undeniable. He didn't just fight the fine, he fought the very concept of authority itself. In doing so, he managed to shift the focus from his actions to the perceived injustices of the system. It was not just about the $500 million, it was about something much larger, a larger conversation about fairness, about the role of the court, and about the very nature of justice in our society. What we witnessed was not merely a legal battle, it was a battle for perception, for narrative, and for the very trust we place in the institutions meant to uphold the law. Ibrahim Traoré may have been fined $500 million, but in many ways it was the court that left that room with more to lose. So as we look back on this extraordinary moment, we are left to ask ourselves, how much can one individual reshape the course of a legal proceeding? How much power do words truly hold? And most importantly, how much can a courtroom be swayed by the force of conviction alone? It's a question we must all ponder as we move forward from this moment in history. I stand before you today, a man who in the eyes of this court is guilty of the charges levied against me. The fine of $500 million, handed down by Judge Thomas, has been presented as a clear symbol of the gravity of my action. To many it is seen as justice, a necessary consequence for what I've done. But let's pause for a moment and think critically about what has just transpired here. You see, that fine, so large, so imposing, does not reflect just the severity of my action. No, it reflects a far deeper issue, one that speaks not only to the penalty imposed on me, but to the very nature of how justice is dispensed in this courtroom and in our society. At first glance, the number $500 million may seem just, it may even seem to those seated here, that such a fine is warranted. But this figure is not simply about the money. It is a symbol, a reflection of something deeper that lies beneath the surface of this case. What Judge Thomas has done is more than issue a punishment. It's an act of power. This fine is not merely about holding me accountable for my actions. It's about reinforcing the authority of the court and asserting control over a system that's designed to maintain order, even when that order is unjust. Let's not forget, we live in a society that constantly seeks to reconcile law and fairness, but how often do these two ideals actually align? The fine I've been given is not simply a financial penalty. It's a statement that the system in which we live believes that its mechanisms of control are sacrosanct. The $500 million isn't just about paying for the mistakes of one man. It's a representation of the power structures at play and how they are willing to impose monumental consequences for the sake of maintaining that power. When Judge Thomas imposed this fine, the question in my mind was never about whether I had committed wrong, That's not what I want to focus on today. No, the more pressing issue is the price we are willing to pay for a system that claims to be fair but too often shows itself to be as punitive as it is flawed. I stand before you as a man caught in the web of this system, not simply as a defendant, but I am not here to argue whether I am guilty. I am here to question how we arrived at a place where a fine of such magnitude could be seen as a fitting resolution to any case, let alone one as complex as mine. If we're honest with ourselves, how often do we look at the systems we create, the courts, the legal precedents, the institutions, and ask if they actually serve justice, or if they serve only to preserve their own power? How often do we fail to recognize that the very structures meant to protect us from harm often become the ones that inflict the most? The $500 million fine I stand before you with is not just the price of my wrongdoing. It is the price of a system that has allowed this kind of punishment to be meted out without even a second thought about its proportionality or fairness. I am not here to simply accept this fine as a rightful outcome of my actions. I am here to challenge you all to look beyond the fine and see the implications of what this decision means. When a fine of this magnitude is so easily imposed, it raises questions about our priorities as a society. What do we value more, the rehabilitation of the individual, or the demonstration of power and authority by the very system that claims to be an impartial arbiter of justice? We must ask ourselves, how many individuals will this system leave behind in its pursuit of power? How many will be crushed beneath the weight of its laws that are as harsh as they are indifferent? I stand before you not as a mere defendant, but as someone who, for the first time, has been given an opportunity to bring a larger issue into the light. I am not here to ask for sympathy or to justify my actions. I am here to ask for something far greater, a reassessment of the entire framework within which we operate. This fine, this overwhelming burden placed upon me is a stark reflection of the injustice that permeates throughout the systems we have built. It is a reflection of the idea that power is far more valuable than equity, far more valuable than the very notion of fairness we claim to hold so dearly. So I ask you to consider this. What kind of society are we becoming if we accept, without question, a system that can impose a fine of this magnitude upon a single individual, regardless of whether it serves any real purpose in achieving justice? What are we teaching the next generation when we allow the mechanisms of power to dictate who is worthy of mercy and who is not? The price for what I have done is high, but the price for what this system demands is far higher, for it has already made its decision, and that decision is not about what is just, but what is convenient for those who hold the power to decide. In the end, my actions may have led to this fine, but it is the system itself that has shaped the outcome. I have been caught in its gears, and while I accept my responsibility, I will not allow this court to overshadow the deeper flaws that this fine represents. So, as you deliberate, I ask you not only to consider the severity of my actions, but also to think about the broader consequences of a system that is willing to impose such a heavy penalty without truly reckoning with the fairness of its own decisions. For it is not the fine that is the true punishment. It is the unquestioning acceptance of a flawed system that perpetuates injustice at every turn. As I stood there in the courtroom, receiving the judgment handed down by Judge Thomas, I could not simply accept it as if it were an unquestionable truth. The fine, the penalty, these are, of course, consequences of my actions, but they are only one side of the equation. What's far more troubling, far more pressing, is the deeper question of why we've arrived at this point in the first place. Why does this system insist on treating my actions as though they are the sole focus, while ignoring the larger systemic issues that have led to this moment? What does it say about our sense of justice when we cannot look beyond the individual, beyond the surface of the case, to understand the machinery behind it? It is not enough to stand here and express regret or accept this fine in silence. I cannot and will not allow my case to be reduced to just another example of a man being punished for his actions. That would be far too easy, far too convenient. If we are to truly pursue justice, then we must not simply look at me and my transgressions. We must look at the framework in which those transgressions occurred. We must look at the very nature of the system that has created this space for punishment, a system that believes its authority is unquestionable, that assumes its own righteousness without ever being held accountable. I stood before this court not to argue my guilt or innocence, but to challenge the very foundation on which these proceedings are built. I did not come to beg for mercy or apologize for what I have done. What I did was wrong, and I am willing to face the consequences of those actions. But what I won't do, what I cannot do, is accept a punishment without first holding a mirror to the system itself. Because if we are truly honest with ourselves, if we are truly seeking justice, then we must ask, does this system of law serve the ideals it professes, or does it simply perpetuate a cycle of punishment without ever addressing the deeper flaws that allow injustice to flourish? As I looked around the courtroom, I could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on me. The judge, the jury, the prosecutors, they all sat there waiting for me to admit my wrongdoing, to fall into the familiar script of remorse and submission. But that was not the role I would play. I refused to let my case become just another footnote in a history of countless others who have stood before a court, accepted their punishment, and been forgotten. This moment right here had to mean more. It had to be more than just my own fate. It had to be about something bigger. In that instant, I chose to shift the conversation away from me and my actions, and instead I turned the court's focus to something far more significant. I raised the uncomfortable question that no one in this room seemed willing to ask: how many times have we allowed the judicial system to pass judgment without ever questioning whether it is truly just? How many times have we quietly accepted the judgments handed down to us, assuming they must be right simply because they come from a place of authority? How many lives have been ruined? How many people have been crushed beneath the weight of this system, simply because they were told that the law is always right? The law, in all its grandiosity, is not perfect. The individuals who stand in this courtroom, those who wear robes and hold gavels, are not infallible. And yet in this very room I was being told to accept a judgment as if it were the final and unalterable truth. But I refuse to do so, not because I believe I am above the law, but because I believe the law itself is flawed. I cannot and will not sit in silence as a guilty man who simply accepts his fate without challenging the very process that got us here. As my words echoed in the room, I could see the discomfort spread across the faces of those present. The jury, once confident in their understanding of this case, seemed to waver. The judge, usually so stoic, seemed uncertain, as though for a moment the authority of the court had been placed under scrutiny in a way it had never been before. And why? Because I dared to ask a question that has been buried beneath the weight of precedent for too long. Who gets to decide what is just? Who in this room can say with certainty that the judgment being handed down is one that will actually lead to fairness, to true justice? The law may be an instrument, but it is not a perfect one. It is written by humans, interpreted by humans, and enforced by humans, all of whom are capable of error, bias, and misjudgment. And yet we are expected to believe that once the law has spoken, once the gavel falls, the matter is closed. No questions, no debate. But I refuse to accept that. I refuse to believe that the justice system, with all its flaws, should go unchallenged simply because it is convenient for some. The $500 million fine was never just about the money, as much as it was about power. The power to decide who is worthy of mercy, who is worthy of suffering, who is worthy of a second chance, and who is not. It is a power that once granted is rarely questioned. It is a power that once exercised leaves little room for correction. And yet here I am, challenging that very power, not because I want to escape the consequences of my actions, but because I believe we must all begin to look more critically at the system that enforces those consequences. We must all begin to ask whether this system is truly just, or whether it is merely a machine that grinds up the vulnerable, the disenfranchised, and the powerless in order to preserve the status quo. I did not come to this court to beg for leniency. I came to demand that we rethink the entire process. I came to demand that we ask ourselves if the law is truly serving its highest purpose. And in doing so, I ask you to consider, what kind of society are we creating if we simply accept the punishment handed down, without ever once questioning the very system that gave birth to it? Justice should not be blind. It should not be indifferent. It should not be a tool used to perpetuate a cycle of power and oppression. And yet that is exactly what it has become. And that, I fear, is the greatest injustice of all. As I stood before this court, it became clear to me that my defense could not simply be about defending my actions. To focus solely on my guilt or innocence would be to fall into a trap set by the very system that had brought me here. It would be to accept without question the narrative that had already been written, a narrative where the law is always right, where the system of justice is flawless, and where those of us who find ourselves at its mercy must simply accept our fate and move on. But I knew that this was not the truth. And I was determined to make sure that truth, however uncomfortable, was brought to the forefront. So I did what I knew would be the most powerful act of all. I shifted the focus. I stopped speaking about myself and my actions, and I started speaking about something far more important, the very nature of the system that was passing judgment on me. The system that had brought me to this point was the same system that had failed countless others before me. It was the same system that allowed injustice to flourish under the guise of order, and I would not let it continue without being questioned. With every word I spoke, I watched the faces around me. The judge, so accustomed to being the authority in the room, looked at me with growing skepticism. The lawyers, who had worked tirelessly to build their case against me, exchanged furtive glances, and the jury, whose judgment would ultimately determine my fate, seemed to hesitate. It was as though I had taken control of the narrative, not by force, but by simply speaking a truth that they were too afraid to confront. I didn't need to raise my voice or make dramatic gestures. My conviction was enough. I knew that by presenting my arguments with clarity and logic, I could shift the power dynamic in that courtroom. I could expose the cracks in the foundation of this so-called justice system. And so, I began to do exactly that. I didn't simply deny my guilt. I didn't simply refuse to accept the $500 million fine as a just consequence. Instead, I began to dismantle the entire framework within which this case was being presented. I questioned the fairness of the trial, the impartiality of the legal system, and the methods by which such a hefty fine could be justified. If I were to accept the fine, I would have been agreeing that the punishment meted out by this system was beyond question, beyond critique. But that, I knew, was not the case. I started by challenging the assumptions that had been made from the very beginning. How many times have we seen individuals like me, caught in the system, treated as little more than statistics or case numbers? How many times have we seen the courts issue fines, penalties, or sentences without ever once questioning whether they truly serve the pursuit of justice, or whether they simply reinforce a system of power and control? I spoke not of my actions but of the larger mechanism that brought us here, and in doing so, I made the court confront the uncomfortable truth. This was not about my guilt alone. This was about a system that had failed to do its job of delivering true justice. I turned the courtroom into a space where the law itself was put on trial. I spoke of how the legal system, in its supposed pursuit of justice, often falls short, how it sometimes serves to perpetuate inequality and to protect those who have the most power, rather than those who are most in need of protection. I talked about how the system was more concerned with upholding its own authority than with ensuring fairness for all who pass through its doors. And in doing so, I made those who were supposed to uphold this system confront its inherent flaws. The judge, who had initially been so confident in the righteousness of his decision, began to show signs of discomfort. He tried to maintain his composure, but I could see the cracks forming. The authority he had once wielded with ease was beginning to waver, and it wasn't just him. The prosecution, who had spent hours presenting their case against me, suddenly found themselves on the defensive. How could they justify the fine, the punishment, when the very system that had brought me here was under such scrutiny? I didn't need to convince everyone in that room that I was right. I didn't need to win the case with my words alone. What I was doing was far more significant. I was forcing everyone in that courtroom to question the very system that had brought us here, a system that often operates in shadows, hidden behind its own complex rules and procedures, blind to the very people it is meant to serve. I was making them see that the fine imposed on me was not just the result of my actions, but also the result of a system that has become detached from its own principles of fairness. In that moment, the courtroom became a battleground, not just for my fate, but for the future of the legal system itself. With every word, I peeled back the layers of authority that had been built around this case. And with each layer I removed, it became more and more clear that this wasn't just about me. It wasn't even just about my guilt or innocence. It was about something much larger, the ongoing tension between power and justice, between authority and fairness. And I was making sure that no one in that room could leave without at least considering the questions I had raised. As the words spilled from my mouth, I could see the jury start to waver. They were no longer certain of their position. What had initially seemed like a simple case now seemed much more complicated, much more layered. They were no longer just considering whether or not I should pay the $500 million fine. They were considering whether the system that had imposed this fine had done so in a way that was truly just. Were they to simply accept the authority of the court, or were they to recognize that sometimes justice is not as clear-cut as the law would have them believe? I didn't need to change their minds. I didn't need them to agree with me completely. But by shifting the focus, by undermining the confidence with which the system had been presented, I had done something far more important. I had made them see that justice is not always as simple as following the rules, and that sometimes those in power must be held accountable for the very systems they create. In that moment, I knew the battle was not just about a fine or a verdict. It was about whether or not we, as a society, were willing to look beyond the surface and confront the injustices within the system itself. And for the first time, the court was forced to reckon with that question. As I stood there speaking my truth, it became apparent that I was no longer just defending myself. I was shifting the very ground on which this trial stood. The jury, whose initial focus had been solely on the legal question of my guilt or innocence, was beginning to wrestle with something far larger. What had seemed like a straightforward case of consequences, my actions, the law, the fine, was now, through my words, being reframed as a profound question about the very nature of fairness, justice, and trust in the system that claims to uphold them. I could feel the shift in the room. The jury, initially certain of the simple narrative that had been presented to them, began to waver. Their faces, once focused and attentive to the details of the case against me, now carried a subtle but undeniable uncertainty. The confident certainty they had entered with began to slip away. It was no longer just about whether I had committed an offense. It was about whether the system in all its complexity was truly fair, whether the rules, as they had been applied, served the greater good, or whether they were part of a larger, more complicated web of power and control. I knew that I had done something critical. I had not simply presented a defense. I had introduced doubt, and doubt in a courtroom is one of the most powerful forces in the world. By shifting the conversation from my personal guilt to the systemic flaws I believed were at play, I was forcing the jury to look beyond the surface. I was forcing them to ask themselves difficult questions, questions that they could not easily answer by simply following the guidelines set before them. Were they going to trust the process, or would they acknowledge, if only for a moment, that the very process that had brought us here was itself imperfect, perhaps even unjust? Would they see the fine, the punishment, as an isolated event, or would they begin to understand it as part of a much larger system, a system that often demands conformity and obedience, without ever asking if it is serving true justice? As I continued to speak, I made it clear that this case was not simply about me. It was about the broader implications of how we view justice in this society. The jury had been tasked with making a judgment about my actions, but I had subtly forced them to question whether they could trust the framework within which they were making that judgment. The question was no longer just about what had happened in this courtroom. It was about the reliability of the very system that had put me here in the first place. I could see their discomfort, the way their eyes flickered back and forth between each other, their body language shifting as they absorbed what I was saying. This was not a case they could resolve with simple answers. They could not simply check the boxes of guilt and penalty and move on. I had made them see that the stakes were higher than that. What was at risk was not just my future, but the integrity of the system itself. And as each moment passed, the jury's certainty about the justice of the fine I faced seemed to erode just a little more. Some might say I was manipulating them, that I was playing on their emotions, their doubts. But I would argue that what I was doing was simply asking them to be honest with themselves. If we are to believe that justice is a reflection of fairness, then how could they possibly ignore the deep flaws that I had brought to the surface? How could they ignore the fact that I was being punished not just for my actions, but for a system that often fails to provide true justice to those who are caught in its web? The jury's task, it seemed, had become far more complicated than they might have anticipated. It was no longer just a matter of deciding whether the fine was a reasonable penalty for my action. It was about confronting the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the legal system itself can perpetuate harm, even as it claims to seek justice. It was about questioning the very foundation of what we consider to be fair and just, and whether the consequences of my actions were truly reflective of a system designed to protect and serve. I had made it clear that the legal system was not an impartial, unfeeling entity. It was a construct of human beings flawed, capable of error, and influenced by power. And power, more than anything else, is what has shaped the trajectory of this case. I had made the jury see that, in seeking justice, they were not simply dealing with an abstract set of rules and guidelines. They were dealing with a system built by people who are just as capable of making mistakes, of being swayed by bias, or even by the desire to maintain their own authority. With every word I spoke, I made them more aware of the delicate balance between fairness and power. Could they truly say that my fine, my punishment, was a result of an objective, fair process? Or was it just the product of a system that had set its own course long before I had ever stepped into that courtroom? Could they, in good conscience, simply accept the ruling without considering how many others had fallen victim to this very system? How many people over the years had been punished not for their actions, but because the system that was meant to protect them had instead failed them? As the trial wore on, I could see the jury struggling with these questions. They had been presented with a clear legal case against me, one that they could have easily resolved by simply following the law as it had been written. But now, thanks to the questions I had raised, the case had become something far more complicated. It was no longer just about my actions. It was about whether they, as members of this system, could reconcile the very idea of fairness with the reality of the system in which they were working. I knew that I was not going to change their minds entirely. I was not naive enough to believe that I could convince them to acquit me based on the systemic issues I had raised alone. But that wasn't the point. The point was to make them think, to make them question, and to make them see that their duty was not simply to follow orders but to ensure that justice in its truest form was served. I had turned the spotlight on the cracks in the system, and it was up to them to decide whether they would ignore them or confront them head-on. In that moment, the jury was no longer just deciding the fate of one man. They were deciding whether they could trust the system that had brought us all here. They were deciding whether justice had truly been served or whether it had been distorted by the very system meant to uphold it. And as they sat in silence, I knew that the decision they made would be far more complicated than anyone could have imagined at the start of this trial. As I continued to speak, I could feel the atmosphere in the courtroom begin to shift. What had once been a case focused squarely on the legalities of my actions and the appropriate penalty for them was now unfolding into something much deeper, more profound. The $500 million fine that had initially been presented as the centerpiece of the trial had in that moment become secondary. What truly mattered was no longer the number nor even the guilt or innocence of a single individual. The real issue at hand, as I had carefully framed it, was the legitimacy of the entire judicial process. The system itself was on trial. I could see it in the way the faces of the court, from the jury to the judge, began to shift. There was a tension in the room, a discomfort that grew as I laid bare the fundamental flaws in the process that had brought us here. It was no longer just about the fine. It was about a much larger question. Had this system of justice truly acted in accordance with its core values? Had it served its purpose of fairness, equity, and protection of all people? Or had it in fact become a mechanism for reinforcing power, control, and privilege? I could feel the eyes of the jury on me. They were no longer simply taking in the details of the case against me. They were beginning to see, perhaps for the first time, the broader implications of what was happening in this courtroom. It wasn't just about the dollar amount, or whether I deserved to pay it. It was about the system that had decided that such a fine could be the solution to a deeper societal issue. The fine, for all its heft, was just a symbol, an expression of a much larger question. How had we allowed the legal system to become so detached from the people it was meant to serve? How had we come to a point where such monumental penalties could be imposed without any real consideration of their fairness, their relevance, or their humanity? As I spoke, I was reframing the discussion in real time. No longer was I a defendant facing judgment for his actions. Instead, I was a voice challenging the court to look deeper, to question the very principles it operated on. I wanted the jury to see that this trial wasn't just a reflection of my actions, it was a reflection of the broader societal structures that dictated how punishment was doled out. It was a reflection of the imbalance of power that defined the relationship between individuals and institutions. And more importantly, it was a moment for the jury to decide whether they would accept the legitimacy of a system that had the power to impose such a significant penalty without ever asking whether that penalty was truly just. I had carefully woven together my argument, not just to defend myself, but to challenge everyone in the room to ask fundamental questions. What had been the guiding principle behind this ruling? Was it fairness, or was it the need to uphold an unchallenged system of power? I asked the jury to look beyond the fine, beyond the legal technicalities, and consider the moral implications of what they were being asked to do. Could they, in good conscience, support a decision that seemed so disproportionate, that ignored the broader context, and that failed to account for the very flaws I had pointed out? And as I spoke, I could see the shift in their eyes, the confusion, the hesitation, the growing awareness. The fine that had seemed so simple at the start of the trial now appeared absurd in light of the deeper questions I had raised. It wasn't just about me, it was about a system that allowed this kind of disproportionate punishment to be handed out with little to no scrutiny, little to no reflection on its fairness. The $500 million fine had become less a reflection of my actions and more a reflection of the brokenness of the system that had imposed it. The more I spoke, the more it became clear that the court had been so focused on the procedural aspects of the case, the fine, the charges, the potential consequences, that it had forgotten to ask the most fundamental question: is this the kind of justice we want? Was this punishment, this staggering fine, the best way to serve the ideals of justice, or was it a product of a system that had lost its way? I wasn't asking the jury to ignore the law. I was asking them to think about the law, about what it really meant, what it really stood for. Could they look beyond the legal process, beyond the precedent, and see the human beings who were affected by it? Could they understand that the system that imposed this fine was not infallible, that it had flaws that needed to be acknowledged if we were ever to reach true justice? The law was not an abstract, untouchable entity. It was a living, breathing construct, made by people influenced by their biases, their fears, and their priorities. I could feel the energy in the courtroom change. The jury, once so focused on their duty to assess the fine and my actions, was now questioning the legitimacy of the very process that had placed them in this position. Their role was no longer just to decide whether the fine was deserved. It was to decide whether they could, in good conscience, stand behind a system that had produced such an outcome. Could they reconcile their personal sense of justice with the system they were being asked to uphold? Could they ignore the deeper implications of this trial, or would they recognize that this case had become a metaphor for something far larger than any one person? In that moment, I knew I had reframed the entire discussion. No longer was it a trial about a fine or about a single individual's actions. It had become a trial about the system itself, a system that, for all its claims of fairness, often operated in ways that were anything but just. It had become a trial about the moral responsibility of those who serve within that system to ask the difficult questions, to hold it accountable, and to demand that it serve the true ideals of justice. The fine in the end would not be the real consequence of this trial. The true consequence would be whether the jury, and all who were watching, could acknowledge that the system they were a part of was not above scrutiny, that its decisions were not infallible, and that its ability to deliver justice was always in question. What I had done was force a conversation that the court had never intended to have. By turning the conversation away from the fine and towards the system itself, I had exposed the cracks in the facade of legal authority, and in doing so I had reframed the narrative from one of punishment to one of accountability, a challenge not just to my own actions, but to the very process that had allowed this situation to unfold in the first place. It was no longer just about my fate. It was about the kind of justice we wanted to live in, the kind of society we wanted to be. And in that moment, the true power of the courtroom shifted. By the time the proceedings were drawing to a close, something had undeniably shifted in the room. It was no longer about the fine, nor about the details of my case. What had once seemed like a simple transaction of guilt and punishment had evolved into a deeper and far more significant exploration. How much authority did the court truly have in shaping the narrative of justice? And how much power did an individual, someone like me, actually possess in disrupting that narrative? By questioning the very foundations of the system, I had managed to shift the balance of power in that courtroom, challenging not just the legality of the fine, but the very legitimacy of the authority that issued it. At the heart of the matter, I had shown that the power of the court, for all its structure and tradition, was not absolute. The courtroom, once a place where all voices were measured by the same legal standards, was now a space where power was being questioned, where my words had become the disruptive force that could not be ignored. And the question that lingered in the air was this: in a system that claims to be just, who truly holds the power to define what is just? Is it the system itself, with all its established authority and precedents, or is it the individuals who challenge it, the ones who dare to ask uncomfortable questions and demand change? As the judge sat in silence, his expression unreadable, I could sense the weight of the moment. I had not only questioned his ruling, I had questioned the very foundation of his authority to issue that ruling. By pointing out the flaws in the system, I had shifted the conversation from one of legal formalities to one of moral reckoning. The fine, which had once seemed like the focal point of the trial, was now a mere symbol of a much larger issue: the imbalance of power in a system that often perpetuates itself without ever questioning whether it serves true justice. I could see the discomfort in the jury's faces. They too had been swept up in the larger conversation I had initiated. They were no longer considering whether the fine was a fair consequence for my actions. They were grappling with the much harder question of whether the system, in its desire to assert control, could ever truly deliver justice in the way it was meant to. They had seen, through my words and my challenge, that the system was not a neutral arbiter of truth. It was a construct of power, shaped by the interests of those who had the most at stake in maintaining it. And now they were left to consider whether they would continue to uphold that system, or whether they would, in that moment, seize the opportunity to reimagine what justice really meant. The balance of power, once solidly in the hands of the court, had been altered. The judge, who had seemed so confident at the start of the trial, now found himself in a precarious position. His authority, built on decades of precedent, was being questioned in real time. The very legitimacy of his power to impose such a hefty fine, such a significant penalty, was now in question. And as I looked around the courtroom, I saw not just a judge and a jury, but a system that was trembling under the weight of its own assumptions. What I had done, in essence, was expose the illusion of neutrality that the court had relied on. I had shown that the legal system, for all its claims to fairness, was often shaped by forces that had little to do with justice. It was shaped by power, by the interests of those who held the most sway over how laws were applied and enforced. And in doing so, I had given the jury and everyone in that courtroom a chance to reconsider their roles in this dynamic. They could either uphold the status quo or acknowledge for the first time that their duty was not to simply follow the rules, but to ensure that those rules were serving the greater good. But the question still hung in the air: how much power does an individual truly have in disrupting the narrative of justice? And in answering that question, I had shown that the power of one voice, one individual, was far greater than most would dare to admit. I had disrupted the flow of the trial, not with force, but with words. I had shifted the balance of power, not by challenging the fine itself, but by forcing everyone in that room to question the very nature of the system that had brought me there. And in doing so, I had reminded them of a fundamental truth: the law, the system, and the authority of those who preside over it are not infallible. They are subject to scrutiny. They are subject to challenge. They are subject to the voices of those who dare to speak truth to power. It became clear to me as the trial neared its end that the fine was no longer the key issue. The larger issue, the one that had slowly taken over the courtroom, was the question of power. Who truly controlled the narrative of justice? Was it the courts, with their procedural rules and established precedents? Or was it the individuals, the people who dared to question and challenge those very rules? And perhaps most importantly, who had the authority to rewrite that narrative when it had become so detached from its original purpose? In the end, I realized that the power to disrupt the narrative of justice was not about winning the case on its technicalities. It wasn't about whether I was found guilty or innocent of the charges against me. It was about forcing everyone in that room to confront the uncomfortable truth that the system, whether it was the court, the laws, or the fines, was not an unquestionable authority. It was a reflection of the power structures that shaped it, and it could be challenged, criticized, and even redefined. The court, the judge, and even the fine itself were secondary now. What mattered, what truly mattered, was the larger conversation I had sparked. A conversation about the nature of justice, the power of individuals to question and challenge it, and the very idea of fairness in a system that so often seems to favor the powerful. I had shifted the balance of power, and in doing so, I had reminded everyone in that room that no system, no matter how entrenched, is immune to challenge. Power, it seems, is always in flux, and sometimes it takes just one person to remind the world of that.